You can run the hills, have a little bit of a spike, and get your heart rate back under control.
Hi guys, it's Neil from the Running Duck Effect, and this week's vlog we're going to talk about MAF running and how I've adapted it to using it on hills and on the trails. I guess if you were running on flat terrain all the time, then it would be quite easy to keep your heart rate at a range which was acceptable to the MAF method. I live in an area where there's some hills, so it probably wasn't practical for me unless I was to go and drive somewhere and run along a flat area, but for me, working towards Tarawera, I realised that I was going to need some hills anyway. So when I first started back using the MAF method, it was walking. It was a lot of walking up hills to keep that heart rate at that level. So after about 4 weeks of using the MAF, pretty much every session I was running the whole way through. It was about this time that I started to introduce some hills and trails. For me to continue running and building distance towards Tarawera, it meant that I needed to get some elevation into my runs and also increasing the distance at the same time. What I did was, rather than just sitting in front of the camera and banging on about how I use hills and trails and then adapted it to work with MAF for me, I thought I'd come out and just show you. Now, it's a little bit windy, so you might get a little bit of wind noise through the microphone, and I'm on an intersection of a busy road, so there might be a little bit of traffic. I'll show you the hill, and I'll show you what I mean, how I've adapted to MAF. So here's the hill. Now in the early stages of MAF, you get to this hill, and you might get to run maybe 10-15 metres up it before your heart rate started to spike. In the early stages of MAF, I would stop and walk the remainder of the hill. Now as I've got fitter and more kilometres in the legs, I've been able to adapt to a shuffle, which is about this pace. Really not much faster than walking. Again, watching the heart rate and just continuing at this pace all the way up to the top of the hill. Keep an eye on the heart rate. If you find that it really does spike, back off. I was able to keep mine pretty much under control through all the hills, and as you go on, you get a little bit quicker going up the hills, mindful of that heart rate all the time. Just a little tip here, when you are running on the roads, make sure you run into the traffic so you can always see what's coming. So I'm at the top of the hill now. Lots of cars. So I check my heart rate. Okay, it's a little high, so we back right off. It may take you longer for your heart rate to return to normal MAF range. For me, it's about 20 or 30 seconds. Okay, we're right to go again. So then we can get back up to a normal pace at MAF levels on the flat or going down a hill. And that's pretty much how I use the hills. So I found myself getting faster on the hills. Now, obviously, when you first start out in MAF, it's very frustrating. You find it very difficult to stay within your acceptable MAF aerobic heart rate range. And that's understandable because you're doing something completely different, and if you've never used heart rate based training before, it will be something completely foreign. I've also found that there's a lot of other factors play with the heart rate as well. We're in the middle of summer here in Brisbane, so the heat, the humidity really push up the heart rate, so you really need to be mindful of that when you're running. Another factor too that I've found is that the wind really affects my heart rate. Now if you're running into the wind, it's only natural that you're going to be working just that little bit harder, so it pushes up the heart rate. It also sort of affects my breathing as well, so that tends to push the heart rate up. And another thing that pushes up my heart rate especially is if I'm talking to the camera when I'm running, heart rate just goes straight up. So I try not to do a lot of filming when I'm running.
especially talking. And today is a perfect example of that because I filmed and talked going up a few of the little hills, and I will put my Strava up for today so you can see just how the heart rate has spiked. So about 30-45 seconds after coming up that hill, my heart rate's gone back to its normal range. So you can see you can run the hills, have a little bit of a spike and get your heart rate back under control. Now I was filming coming up that hill as well, so my heart rate was probably a little bit higher than it should be, but it comes back under control really quickly. Just keep that in mind when you're running hills. Oh, it's raining again. Might take this opportunity just to talk a little bit about MAF and how I've used it on the trails. In the early stages I would walk the hills, but as the fitness returned I started to shuffle up the hills. I think it's horses for courses. Like, if you're going to follow the MAF 100%, then I really think that you probably need to be just on flat ground. I needed to put some hills into my running because of Tarawera. We're about 12 weeks into MAF. I'm still probably only shuffling up the hills, but I'm running pretty much all the way. It's a little bit of common sense. I've made sure that the heart rate hasn't been too high on the trails. You know, when I've got to the top of a hill, I've pretty much slowed down, allowed the heart rate to return to a normal range. Now, in the past few weeks, when I've been out on the trails, I've pretty much disregarded the heart rate now. You know, I feel that my fitness is at a reasonably good level. I've really needed to start running some hills and really just concentrating on time out on the trails, time on the feet. Distance isn't sort of worrying me too much, just trying to get as much elevation as I can now. I'm not going to get enough elevation before Tarawera, but I felt it's probably more important for me coming back from the broken ankle to spend time on legs rather than trying to get too much elevation. The last couple of weeks I've been sort of around the 1500 to 2000 meters of elevation for the week. Now for Tarawera it's about 1500 meters of elevation, so probably not doing the right amount of elevation to have myself in good shape for Tarawera, but you know, I just wanted to make sure that I got to a reasonable level of fitness, and I think I've done that.
Probably judging by that, I haven't really stuck completely 100% to the MAF method, but it's worked for me to allow me to return from injury, build some kilometres and get some elevation for the ultra trail. Well, MAF has really worked for me. I've had to sort of adjust it to work even better for me, and you know, some people will agree with what I've done, some people won't, but that's how I've got around using the MAF. I think that as part of my running there is definitely a place for MAF, and even going forward, you know, my plan is to continue running some of my sessions at MAF levels. And so alright guys, that's about it for another week. Thanks for taking the time to get through to the end of the video. Also thank you to everyone too from last week with my shoe dilemma and suggesting shoes that I should look at. I'll take all those comments that you left on board. Next week, because we're getting really close to Tarawera, I'm going to talk about my preparation, my first ultra trail. Hope you have a great week running, and I'll catch you next week. Hooroo!